Hey everybody, how are you doing? This is Rob of Rule of Two Review. Welcome back to the channel, and today I want to discuss the impending, looming next generation. According to what Sony and Microsoft are saying, they are right around the corner, sometime before the end of 2020, which at this point, tomorrow is August 1st, which means we've only got a couple of months to go. And while of course that is very exciting, there's still a lot of information we're waiting to understand about these consoles and the next generation, including obvious stuff like price and release dates, and whether or not these things actually end up getting delayed. I'm somebody who honestly thinks there is still a tiny chance that somehow one of those consoles ends up moving into 2021. But beyond just those two consoles and that next generation, obviously I want to talk about Nintendo and how Nintendo themselves fits into this whole next generation conversation. Obviously, when we think of Nintendo and this next generation, we think Nintendo's next console, Nintendo's next hardware, whatever their next generation machine is going to actually be. Whether it's a Switch 2, whether it's some sort of home console thing, whatever they decide to do, maybe even something new that none of us could ever possibly envision, which is kind of Nintendo's MO. How do they, with whatever their next hardware is going to be, fit into what Sony and Microsoft are probably going to be doing? And a lot of this boils down to the weirdness of the Nintendo Switch and the weirdness of when the console released, right? So when we start to break down the generations, the movement of this current generation into the next generation, you start to look at the pieces of what Nintendo did, and it does make things a little bit weird. The Wii U effectively kicked off the 8th generation, or this current generation if you want to call it, back in 2012. And only a year later, Sony and Microsoft followed suit with their PS4 and their Xbox One, thus creating what we basically know as the 8th generation. The Nintendo Wii U, the Sony PlayStation 4, the Xbox One by Microsoft. However, things got really weird when, way sooner than Nintendo would have planned, they had to move on from the Wii U because it wasn't very successful, and only a couple of years into that console's life and the PS4 and Xbox One's life, the Wii U goes away, here comes the Nintendo Switch. That much more capable of a machine, suddenly we're able to see and run more ideal versions of games coming out on the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. So while it is Nintendo's next generation jump over the Wii U, and you could call it their, quote, 9th generation machine, it is something that really only helped Nintendo catch up a little bit to Sony and Microsoft, more in terms of power. Obviously, Nintendo leaped them in terms of capability because the Switch allows us to play portable and home console. So you've got these kind of two competing ideas of what's more capable, what the current generation is. Is it more power and graphics? Is it more ways to play your games? Either way, in my opinion, I saw Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft get a little bit more level in the playing field. Also around this time, we saw Sony get ready to release the PlayStation 4 Pro and Microsoft to release the Xbox One X, so we saw small iterative jumps within those consoles' lives, but we didn't really truly move on from those. We've still been existing in this current generation. I feel like it's more comfortable to remove the label of 8th generation from this generation and just call it the current generation, because when you start throwing in the numbers, everything gets weird because of Nintendo and the Wii U and the Switch. That truly changes everything. So in this generation, I made my own personal decision to remove numbers from how we describe things. I mean, maybe I could say the generation began as the 8th generation, and I think that's true when we just had a Wii U, a PS4, and an Xbox One. But now, things are so different coming to the end of the PS4 and the Xbox One, 3 years into the Nintendo Switch's life, 3 years since the Wii U has been defunct and gone away. Things are too crazy to call it the 8th generation, so to me, it is the current generation. And with the introduction of the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5, I personally see it as moving on to the next generation. No more numbers, we can't look at that stuff because you start looking at 9th generation Switch, 9th generation PS5, and it gets weird because I think a lot of us think that Nintendo will be moving on to next generation hardware sooner than later, which further leads into this whole idea of how they specifically are going to fit in to this next generation. Now, there has been some information and some chatter going around the past couple of days about Nintendo apparently putting $800 million into new R&D into something that no one in the public space, at least, really seems to know what it is, okay? So is it more weird technology like Labo stuff? Is it new software? Is it acquiring new companies? Is it maybe a Nintendo Switch Pro, right? Some other SKU or some other model or version of the current Nintendo Switch? Or, as a lot of people have gotten excited talking about, is it their next generation hardware? Because we have to remember, a Switch 2 is different than a Switch Pro, right? These are different things. A Switch Pro, if it exists, which I'm now starting to doubt every day, right? Doesn't seem like it makes sense. If a Switch Pro even existed, it's still like the 2017 tech that is the Nintendo Switch, but with some modifications and some upgrades, maybe even some fairly significant upgrades, but at the end of the day, it would still be the Switch. It would still have to be based on the architecture that is running 2017 versions of Nintendo Switch titles. First party, third party, whatever the case, right? A Nintendo Switch 2, if they wanted to stick with the Switch concept, would be a whole new beast. Suddenly, in theory, we would have something that would be capable of running similar games to what the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X will be doing. And to me, that whole idea is really the crux of the next-gen conversation between all three companies. I've definitely touched on this idea in the past, over the past few years, and I want to definitely reiterate it and really focus in on here in this conversation for you guys. And it really is the multi-platform game scenario that truly makes me focus in on Nintendo and what they might be doing. Yes, there are these signs about $800 million. Is this them moving on to next generation hardware, whatever. The tricky thing for me when it comes to that is that I've honestly, and if you followed me for the past, I would say close to 2 years, you would have heard me say this on many videos. I've already been predicting around this time would be when Nintendo would start to move on to the next generation, that they would start to really be planting their seeds for moving on to that new hardware. I've long since had the target year of 2022, give or take, for the ideal time for Nintendo to release their next hardware, right? And so I've already been thinking that. I didn't need this recent information about a possible $800 million put into some nebulous thing we don't understand to kickstart the next generation Switch conversation in my brain, because I've been talking about it, like I said, for a year and a half, maybe even 2 years. And there are the two main reasons that I've already been predicting a new Switch around that time. One of them is the fact that we do have a PlayStation 5 and an Xbox Series X coming. So regardless of even the multi-platform thing, the simple fact that Nintendo's two competitors, and yes, they are competitors, that Nintendo's two competitors are getting ready to move on to the next generation, which will, in effect, move the entire industry to the next generation. I don't care how much you want to push against that. You are wrong. When Sony and Microsoft together move from the current gen to the next gen machines in the same ballpark time frame, the entire industry is going to be moving along with them, okay? I'm a bigger Nintendo fan than I am Sony or Microsoft, okay? I'm with the Nintendo community who wants to say that they define everything. But that's not really how it works. You get two of the three main players moving on to new machines, to new hardware, and to new, more powerful hardware that is more capable than what the third guy, Nintendo, is doing. That means the whole industry is going to move along with them. They're keeping more tied in tow with even what PC hardware is capable of than Nintendo would be doing at this point. So what I'm trying to say is, when Nintendo's two main competitors move on to the next generation and take the industry along with them, Nintendo simply can't ignore it as much as they do carve out their own path and move to the beat of their own drum, as we all know that they do. They can't ignore it for too long. Maybe for a little bit, maybe for a year or two, they can ignore it and let Sony and Microsoft have the runway of now we're in the next generation. But within a year or two, I do think Nintendo has to have an answer and a response, and it's not a Nintendo Switch Pro, and it's not to ignore them and keep doing what they're doing, even though the Switch is selling very well right now, of course. It would be to answer with new hardware. And then, of course, that brings me back to the second main reason it's made sense to me for so long, and, like I said, it's the multi-platform game situation. At the end of the day, third-party support for any company, any hardware manufacturer is important. That includes Nintendo, that includes Sony, that includes Microsoft. Third-party support matters. Even for Nintendo, which lives and dies on its amazing first-party content, and we all know that, That doesn't mean that third-party companies and those titles carry no weight for Nintendo or for the game-buying public. Yes, they obviously do. No one can convince me otherwise, and if you think that they don't really care about third-party support, you're fooling yourself, okay? We can love and cheer the first-party support for Nintendo all day long and how it is enough to kind of keep them afloat if that's all they had. But we've also seen evidence that they really struggle without that third-party support. And in the Switch era, they've been doing pretty darn well with the third-party support. Not only getting third-party games, but those games are actually selling on the Switch. That is the difference with the first 2 years of the Wii U, where there was third-party support, but they were last-gen ports, and they were not really selling on the Wii U. But on the Switch, they're selling. Therefore, they're making a huge dent and a huge impact that Nintendo and those other companies don't want to ignore. If Sony and Microsoft, I should say, when Sony and Microsoft move to the next generation and the industry and all the third-party developers move along with them to make games to run on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X 2020 tech that is more, like I said, in line with PC games and PC capabilities, the 2017 Switch ain't gonna be cutting it in the power department. Yes, okay, the games are going to be great. The system is still going to be amazing because it's portable and console. Like, yeah, I love those things about it, and those things won't stop being good, but the quality of multi-platforms are certainly going to stop being good, and eventually, people, Nintendo fans and non-Nintendo fans alike, will start to pick apart the fact that we're seeing this amazing next-generation, never-before-seen stuff on the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, and they're still looking at, even maybe the best games on the Nintendo Switch. We're going to start to see a huge disparity between what the consoles are capable of and what we're seeing on Nintendo and what we're seeing on the other guys, and that's going to matter to the game-buying public, so it's going to have to matter to Nintendo. And when we look at those third-party multi-platform games, we're not going to be seeing the next versions of Mortal Kombat and Doom or Call of Duty or Madden or XYZ, whatever thing, Grand Theft Auto. I don't even care. You start naming all these big third-party titles that we actually care about and are going to maybe want on our Nintendo console, and we're not going to see them on the 2017 Switch if we're a year or two into the 2020 PS5 and Xbox Series X. Nintendo will need something more capable that can keep kind of it up to step with the PS5 and the Xbox Series X. That's part of what makes the Switch so great, right? Is the Wii U couldn't really achieve the same quality third-party games that the PS4 and Xbox One were, but the Switch has been able to do that. We have Doom, we have Wolfenstein, we have Mortal Kombat 11. Doom Eternal is on its way. There's so many other things. We know that we can now do that, and even if they're not as good, they're good enough, and they're the same games we're seeing on these other consoles. That won't be the case once we move to the next generation. The current Switch ain't going to be able to cut it. And so these two reasons that I've spent all this time talking to you about are why I feel like Nintendo, within a year or two, again, my prediction, 2022 target, I think they're going to be moving on to this next generation to be part of the next generation. Even if we're going to say, oh, well, that's their 10th generation machine, and Sony and Microsoft are behind in the 9th generation. No way. That will not be the case. Anyone who wants to say that, if a next Nintendo console comes out in like 2022 that is way more capable like the PS5 and Series X, I don't want to hear conversations about Nintendo's in the 10th gen and Microsoft and Sony are in the 9th gen, especially if the next Nintendo console is still not as powerful or capable as Sony and Microsoft's machines. There's no defense for saying that they would be behind in the 9th generation compared to Nintendo in the 10th if Nintendo's next console is not as capable. Which is why I don't even care about the numbers anymore, okay? So I'm not trying to make a case for the number naming thing that we've been doing. The case that I'm making is we need to just eliminate it, okay? So don't even put those numbers in your brain. But I'm already anticipating people having that conversation and talking and thinking that way, and it's mind-numbing because it is so just being unaware of the situation around all three of these companies. And so, anyway, I'm jumping ahead by a couple of years to even start worrying about that conversation, but I just know it's coming, and I can already tell you it's going to be silly. And so what this whole conversation boils down to is I am excited for the PS5 and the Xbox Series X. I think that they're probably going to be great. I'm sure they'll have a stumbly first year. That's usually how new consoles are, but eventually I know the games are going to start catching up with those machines. and they're going to be great. And hell, each one is launching with an amazing game. We have Spider-Man Miles Morales on the PS5 and the one and only Halo launching the Xbox Series X. I know there's some controversy around the graphics of Halo Infinite. That's whatever. It's its own thing. I'll tell you what, it's not going to matter when the game launches because it's going to sell like crazy, and I guarantee it is going to be a good and fun game that people like. So it's going to make an impact, even if you think the graphics look bad and the ogre looks like Shrek, you know, like, who cares? The game is going to be huge, and it's going to help sell Xbox Series X's, absolutely. So, you know, those are going to be great, but eventually Nintendo has to slide themselves into that race, and I just really think that they're going to. Whether you want to focus on my two logical positions that I stated here, or whether you want to focus on the $800 million R&D thing, which I'm not trying to say is illogical, I'm just trying to say is a different approach to maybe why somebody would believe Nintendo's working on new hardware. Whichever one of these factors, or maybe another factor that's unique to you, is what you're focusing on, I guess, I don't know. It just seems like there's enough reason for us to believe Nintendo would be doing it, right? They're not going to do the 10-year Switch thing like Kamiya said years ago that everyone was so attached to. It's not going to happen. We're moving on from that thing sooner or later. Sony and Microsoft are leading the charge. Nintendo, I think, will be following suit within a year or two afterwards. And honestly, that's going to be great. I mean, who's not going to be excited about it at the time that happens? We're all going to be like, great, new Nintendo hardware. We're all excited for PS5s and Series X's now. And then we can get another brand new console, next generation console, in the years following that. So it's all going to be good stuff the way I see it. There's no negativity here. Nothing negative to say about Nintendo, Sony, or Microsoft. That is not what this conversation is. We're just getting excited for how things are going to play out. And I think Nintendo will eventually be a part of that conversation. So that's what I think. You hear my thoughts and opinions. Now I want to hear your thoughts and opinions. Tell me what you think about this whole next-gen race. How do you see Nintendo fitting into it? And with that, this video is a wrap. Thanks, of course, as always, for tuning in, guys. This is Rob of Rule of Two Review, and I'll catch you next time on another video.